We're now going to discuss the Great Depression and the New Deal. And Herbert Hoover is going to take the blame for this. He does have very bad luck. Scenes from his presidency include pictures of Hoovervilles and soup kitchens. Soup kitchens were actually very common, and some were run by Al Capone. He used his personal money to pay for 10,000 people to eat every week in soup kitchens. And people were also having huge psychological ramifications. They were losing their homes and living in homeless encampments called Hoovervilles, as you'll see right here. A Hoover blanket was the stuffed newspaper into your clothing to insulate yourself against the heat. So he's going to take the blame for all of this. And the Depression is going to filter across the entire country. In the Midwest, they're going to face an enormous dust storm. These dust storms were actually visible all the way to New York. Essentially what had happened was there had been a great drought in the Great Plains that had started in the 1880s. And after there was the drought, there were dust storms, and because of over-cultivation of soil, where we hadn't been fertilizing the soil but been planting the same type of crop over and over and over, that topsoil gets loose and is going to create huge dust storms. People could actually die in these dust storms. Your lungs would get filled with dirt. This is going to propel people moving from the Midwest into California. It was dubbed the Garden of Eden, and if any of you have ever read Grapes of Wrath, it is pretty much as John Steinbeck depicted. So there were Okies and Arkies, or people from Oklahoma and Arkansas, moving and migrating out west to California, in specifically the LA region, Central Valley, and then a few up north into Oregon and Washington. People literally got into their cars and headed west in hopes of finding work. Now I'm going to show you a clip of the PBS video, The Dust Bowl. It is with Ken Burns, and I'm sure you all are mature enough not to laugh at his amazing haircut.
The Red Sea closing in on the Israel children, and I'm telling you, it got so black when that thing hit, we all run into the house. And a lot of people in the crowd that was religious minded, and they was up pretty well on the scriptures, and they said, well, boys, girls, friends, and relatives, this is the end. This is the end of the world.
This was a 10-year apocalypse that I don't think we can fully appreciate, because we tend to pigeonhole stuff in American history and say, oh, this is the Grapes of Wrath, boom, done. It's much more complicated than that. And the story of the human beings that survived this 10-year apocalypse is one of the most moving and one of the most dramatic stories I think we've ever come across. This project was born 2 decades ago. Dayton Duncan wrote a marvelous book called Miles from Nowhere, in which he visited many of the least populated counties, some of which are in.
A number of people who told me these incredible stories about the dust being so bad that they would huddle in the shacks of their homes with claws over their face, and they were just incredible stories, both in terms of an environmental story, of human folly, but also of human courage and suffering and perseverance. So that got me interested in it at first, and then a lot of other things, intervened, other films, other stories. But it was always on the list of films that I was hoping that Ken and I would get around to doing.
It's the testimony of more than 24 human beings who lived through it, who survived the greatest man-made catastrophe, environmental catastrophe in American history, superimposed over the greatest economic cataclysm in world history, the Great Depression.
First of all, this was a 10-year drought, so that was a longer than normal drought. It just didn't let up. It just started and kept on going. It was a harmonic convergence of bad things, of a badder than usual drought, hotter than usual temperatures, and more soil exposed for the first time than ever before in history, due to both bad farming practices and human nature, thinking that they could make a quick buck. And all those things combined to make it just hell on earth.
All the birds, everything was flying south. We could see this thing rolling in. And my brother told me he thought the end of the world was coming. Well, of course, that scared me half to death, and I wasn't so sure about it.
We've been working on this project now for several years. I still can't fully comprehend what it must have been like to be in one of these black blizzards, towering mountain ranges coming at you more than a mile high, sometimes 200 miles wide, that could blot out the sun and make it inky black during the day, where you couldn't even see 3 or 4 feet in front of you, that there was not a safe place from the dust.
If it was one that was blowing more of a sand blow, as they were sometimes called, that would be closer to the ground, and these grains of sand, people would say, could strip the paint off of your car. Obviously, if you were out there and exposed to it, it could hurt like hell when it hit you. If you went inside, newspapers sold special gum tape to put around the edges of your windows and under your doors and other things to try to keep this dust from getting in. Nothing worked entirely.
Before these storms happen, there's an incredible phenomenon that builds up a lot of energy, a kind of static charge.
I can remember feeling it in my hair. It just kind of like your head tingles or something, your hair just kind of wiry.
If you reach out to touch a car, the electricity will jump out about 6 inches to meet you and knock you right flat on your butt.
It would short out the electrical system, the radio, other functions of the car, and so people took to dragging chains behind them just to ground automobiles.
They were tough times. They were really, really tough times. We didn't know what the devil was going to happen next.
It seems to me as if we were all just suddenly picked up and deposited back into the Old Testament Egypt with the Israelite people, as Woody Guthrie would say, that there were plagues of jackrabbits because nature had become so unbalanced. That there were plagues of locusts that afflicted these people. It wasn't just the dust storms, as if that wasn't enough for 10 years, that you had the poverty of the Depression, that people are trying to get out, people are starving. This has got to be a cataclysm that we don't just see as an environmental parable, which it is, but as a human story, a human drama, in some ways unequaled in this tiny, forgotten part of this glorious continent.
All right, I know you loved his hair. So by this point, Americans were doing something for the very first time that they hadn't done before. And basically, they start to question the Protestant work ethic. People who had worked hard and played by the rules were in a terrible state. They were in complete disaster. It was basically the question of, is the American way the best way? This had never been questioned before, and this was the first time in history we'd asked this question, and it was a huge psychological trauma. Basically, everything was turned around and twisted and totally nuts and just totally wacko and wackadoodle. So at this time, people start to turn to socialism and communism for the answers. So not everybody turns to this, but many do. And these people get totally nailed in the 1950s when we're going to have the second Red Scare looking for socialists and communists in our midst. So essentially, we're having an economic and identity crisis, and there is some hope to improve things. Hoover did work very hard, but he was extremely reluctant to have the federal government jump into things and start doing things. He was very, very concerned that if the federal government got too involved, people would start losing their liberties. But in 1930, Hoover lost the Republican majority in Congress, and things are going to get worse for him. In 1932, it's going to be the bottom of the Depression. So Hoover did everything on the sly to fix things, but people thought he was sitting around just collecting his paycheck. But actually, in all his years of public service, he never collected a check. Pretty cool. But things are going to get worse for him, and that's going to be with the March of the Bonus Army. This was made up of the veterans of World War I. Back in 1924, they'd voted in Congress that in 1944 they should each get a $1,000 bonus for having fought in World War I. That was a ton of money at this time. And these guys decide that they want the money now. They need the money now. So they march and camp on Washington. Congress says, no, we can't give you your money now. Many of them, though, had nowhere else to go, so they decided to just stay there. However, someone convinced Hoover, or one of his advisors convinced Hoover that these people were a threat. And against Hoover's better judgment, the federal government sent in the police and the U.S. Army, who brought in tanks, machine guns, etc. Violence quickly ensued, and essentially the Bonus Army was run out of town. This was all happening in the shadow of the Capitol, and people were horrified. These were the same men who, only 14 years before, had fought for the country, and this seemed to be what they would get. So Hoover worked very hard, but didn't have very much to show for it. And in 1932, for the presidential election, the Republicans renominated him. The Democrats, remember, haven't won an election since 1916. There was essentially a stampede to beat the Democratic candidate, and they nominate Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the governor of New York, aka FDR. He had that magic name, Roosevelt. TR had died in 1919, and people remember him as one of the most beloved presidents. FDR's career almost paralleled TR's as well, but they had a few interesting differences. They have a few differences. So TR was a genius. FDR had what you call a first-rate, second-rate mind. He was very bright, but not a genius. The next similarity and difference is leadership. So TR was a real leader, but FDR was much more cautious. They were both extreme masters of the media at the time. FDR was going to be a master of the radio media, and FDR was basically TR was a master of every media, and FDR becomes very, very good at the radio because now remember the radio is available. FDR gets on the radio and he starts talking about a new deal. This reminds people of TR and the Square Deal. And in the campaign of 1932, FDR promised Americans this new deal. So he didn't actually have a plan for the New Deal, but it sounded good. It sounded like the Square Deal. And since he wasn't quite a deep thinker, but a very skilled politician, he was able to sell this to the American people. It's important also to note that FDR did have polio and was in a wheelchair. He was not often seen in public in the wheelchair. The press actually took care not to depict him in the wheelchair. You'd usually see pictures of him standing. He had leg braces so he could stand, but he would be leaning against somebody or against a podium. His bout with polio came later in life. Before he'd been a real jock. He'd been very athletic, very, very active, and polio definitely changed him. But it did leave him with a more empathetic approach for people where he understood how hard life could be, and that ends up helping him very much as president. So FDR had been elected in November of 1932, but doesn't come into office until March of 1933. So he's the president-elect, and Hoover was a lame duck president with his term almost over. Hoover was still sort of in charge, but Hoover and Roosevelt could not seem to get on the same page. Hoover particularly didn't want to start anything new if FDR wouldn't finish it. So basically, with Hoover unwilling to lead, nobody is in charge. And it's at this point the Depression hits rock bottom. We are going to have more bank failures caused by bank runs. The problem is that people have lost their jobs, they can't pay their bills, and the banks are repossessing their property. So people start going to the bank to get their cash, but the bank doesn't have it on hand. So then, when the banks don't have the money, the banks end up closing. Today, bank running is a federal crime, but then it was spreading really fast, and thousands of banks were failing for normal Americans, and back then the federal government didn't comp you if you lost your money. So people are losing their entire life savings as these local banks are closing, and by late February of early March we're in a bad place. But on March 4th, 1933, FDR comes into office, but it is the most horrible time in the nation. So his first problem is going to be to end the bank runs. He declares a bank holiday, just a nice way to say every bank in the United States is closed until further notice. Remember, he was also a master communicator, and he comes up with the idea of the fireside chat to use the radio to speak to millions of Americans at a time. These would happen usually on a Sunday night, and he basically is going to reach millions of people and become sort of the national cheerleading coach for the American people. This is going to be the first time we see a president talk so directly to the American people, and it becomes something that people actually really look forward to hearing their president speak in their living room every Sunday evening. So as Roosevelt is holding this sort of national pep rally, he's going to explain the New Deal to the American people. The first thing to remember is that there was no coherent plan to the New Deal. It was consistent experimentation. So here's a quote from FDR. He said, "The country needs and demands bold, persistent experimentation. It is common sense to try to take a method and try it. If it fails, admit it frankly and try another. But above all, try something." It's also important to remember that the New Deal did not end the Great Depression. It was World War II that ended the Great Depression. Even FDR would have agreed that the New Deal did not end the Great Depression, and anybody who tells you otherwise is historically illiterate. All right, so remember that essentially the stock market's not going to start to recover until around 1942, and it won't be until 1951 that we reach pre-Depression levels. However, what the New Deal does do, and that the New Deal is so successful at, is giving us back our American optimism. And in all of this, Eleanor Roosevelt was FDR's biggest asset to his presidency. She basically pushed things on FDR right after he became president. So one of the first things that happened was that the bonus marchers came back, and Franklin sent Eleanor down to see them, and she brought them coffee and donuts and reassurance from the First Lady. So here she is with the bonus marchers, and they loved her. She treated the veterans with great respect. The press respected her as well, and most people, when they met her, really loved her and felt like they were telling someone their troubles who would then go and directly tell the president. This helped create even more of a bond between the people and FDR. It's also important to note that she was a huge proponent of racial justice. She said the New Deal was colorblind, and she really raised hell about segregation in the Army. She thought it was absolutely wrong. Even after FDR died, she joined the UN and became a sort of first lady of the world. So really, really cool. Yes, she was FDR's fifth cousin, once removed, didn't have to change her last name, but it's all very Downton Abbey. So when FDR takes office, there's going to be a burst of legislative activity from Congress. There was a sense of emergency that was so great that it really transcended party lines, and this was known as the first 100 days of his presidency. He was going to pass 15 pieces of major legislation in 3 months, which is pretty much unheard of. He is also going to find a purpose for his New Deal. He's going to call it the 3 R's. They go into 3 different themes: relief, recovery, and reform. So at this point, you should have out your New Deal handout to follow along with. So the first goal is to be sure that we have relief. So Americans need to have jobs. The second will be recovery, to help businesses and agriculture get going again. And then the third one will be reform, to make sure we never repeat this. The first big piece of legislation was called the National Recovery Association, and this was a very important piece of legislation with the goal of getting the economy rolling again. Essentially, the NRA suspended the antitrust laws that were in place because the government said so, and everyone had to sign onto a new business code to show that you were doing your part, that there would be fair wages and jobs. So businesses would also come together and set prices for products, almost like trusts. This was all in an attempt to reverse the cycle that had started the Depression in the first place. But the tough part was that we had to convince the people to do what they didn't want to do, and that was mainly to spend their very last pennies. The country was bombarded by propaganda to buy stuff and to spend money, spend, but how can we actually do this? But what we're actually doing is generating action, and the American people felt good that we were doing something. Even if we weren't sure it was going to work, we were doing something and we were taking some action. The next piece of recovery legislation was the Agricultural Adjustment Act. And basically this was something for the farmers. This was to help farmers make enough food without driving down prices. Remember that the farmers were in a depression before the rest of the country. They have a paradox too, because productivity is not good for them because it drives down prices and then it makes no money. And so what AAA tries to do is create shortages. So one way to do this was to eliminate things from the economy. They would actually encourage farmers to plow under parts of their crops. And on a really sad note, in 1933, the government bought 5 million baby pigs from farmers and just killed them. He didn't use them, but it was an idea also to create a meat shortage. They also pay for farmers to not grow things on portions of their land. So the next is the WPA and the PWA. So that's the Works Progress Administration and the Public Works Administration. These are two very, very, very similar programs. So what's important for you to know is that they're both doing the same thing. They're both building things. They lay about 600,000 miles of road, 300 airports, and the main legacy is that they build stuff. And this includes the WPA's Federal Theater Project. Basically, they put out-of-work actors and actresses to work. The government sponsors plays, government artwork, and so on. So basically, people who were non-essential to the economy were hired to write stuff, plays, and then you'd put on these plays and keep everybody employed during the Depression. So here we have one of the posters for the federal stage shows, as well as young men putting together, I'm actually not sure what that is. So here we have a federal stage shows poster, part of the WPA, as well as young men building a bridge. Historians, which were another apparently non-essential part of the economy, were sent down to the South to see if they could find any old former slaves to interview, and they actually found a lot and wrote narratives for the WPA. We actually read a few in class during our Reconstruction unit. So up next, we're going to move on to the Civilian Conservation Corps. So this is another relief program. Once again, they put young men 17 to 25 to work on conservation projects. This would include things like planting trees, because it was, remember, we have an increased interest in conservation after Theodore Roosevelt, and so there's going to be more opportunities for conservation. Next, we move on to the reform movements. So essentially now the government was going to Wall Street. This had been the only part of the progressive era reforms. So now we're going to move on to the reform movement. So essentially now the government is going to Wall Street. Wall Street had not been touched by the progressives, and FDR decides to now do something about this and regulate Wall Street. We're going to finish up what the progressives had started. The goal was that there was going to be no more crime, fraud, or buying on the margin. So he's going to pass the SEC, or the Securities and Exchange Commission, and this was created to regulate and govern stock investments and all of that stuff. Basically, they have to tell a buyer about the risks. It's going to help control and regulate Wall Street. The next reform movement will be the creation of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or the FDIC. When you're listening to bank commercials today, you've probably heard them say at the very end, or a member of FDIC, and that is exactly what they're talking about. So the FDIC was created to prevent bank runs. It basically says that the government will assure people that they will get their money back if a bank fails. Now, this hasn't actually been tested. Bank runs are essentially now illegal, but the idea then is this sort of psychological reassurance that your money is safe. The next program that encompasses all three R's was the Tennessee Valley Authority. The goal was to get electricity into the Tennessee Valley. Basically, this was an underdeveloped region in the South, and many people didn't have electricity in this area that's near the Tennessee River Valley. It runs through about a dozen states, actually. And these places, we used to also get horrible, horrible floods. So the idea now is we're going to put dams on the rivers in the South and generate hydroelectric power. This is going to provide government jobs, and it's also going to be sure that the electricity companies are charging a fair wage. So that is going to be the reform element here, that the people, the consumer, can't get ripped off. All right, so that's where we're going to end today. Thank you very much for listening, and have a great spring break. I'll see you when you get back.